There's a lot of things you can ask about South Dakota right now. We've got an attorney general that's in trouble. We got a governor that's in trouble. We've got all types of things that everybody's pointing to and saying, what is going on in South Dakota? But the one that really got the attention of the nation was, I don't know whether you call it money laundering, I don't know, but people are putting whatever means they have into South Dakota without being South Dakotans. Casey Michel joins us. Casey is author of American Kleptocracy. Casey, good to have you coming down the road with us.
Great to be here, Joel. Thanks so much for having me talk all things kleptocracy with you today.
Let's begin there. Let's talk about what it is. First off, for those people who don't understand it, explain it to them.
Sure. So the title of the book, again, is called American Kleptocracy. The book itself is about how the U.S. broadly has transformed into, as I argue, the world's greatest offshore and financial secrecy haven. So this is looking at things, especially states, places like Delaware, places like Nevada, places like Wyoming, that have created this whole industry of what we call shell companies. And I think a lot of the listeners may have heard of shell companies. These allow you to anonymously control your wealth. You don't even have to be in the country. You don't have to be in these states, but you can move your money however you want. And we see a lot of dictators. We see a lot of oligarchs. We see a lot of kind of the worst people in the world, arms traffickers, narco traffickers, coming to the U.S. to take advantage. And I think there's maybe a baseline understanding that we see places like Delaware, kind of the shell company capital of the world. But as we saw just last week, Joel, there was a leak of millions and millions of documents. It's called the Pandora Papers. And listeners may be familiar with some of the other leaks we've seen in recent years. But what was really important for me, what was really impactful for me and a number of other people that cover this, is that it's not just confirming what we've all suspected, the dictators, their families, they're all coming to the U.S. for their money laundering needs. What it turns out is that so many of them are coming not to Delaware or New York or California. So many of them are coming to South Dakota. And that's for one primary reason that we can go into details here in a little bit. But South Dakota over the last few years has exploded into one of the world's leading offshore and financial secrecy havens. And again, we're talking about the worst people in the world. Anybody who has a little bit of dirty money in their pocket looking to escape investigators, looking to escape tax authorities, looking to escape human rights activists, journalists elsewhere, they are coming to South Dakota to take advantage in particular of South Dakota's trust industry. So at the very kind of 10,000-foot level, this is what has happened in South Dakota without many of us paying any attention. It has begun taking in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in perfectly anonymous, untraceable wealth. Nobody has any idea where it's coming from or what it's being used for.
How are they doing it? How obviously you just pointed out how South Dakota allows it, and we can ask whether or not they encourage it, but how do they do it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joel. The short answer is very easily. What we've seen develop in South Dakota in the last few decades. So we're talking back in the 1980s, very deregulatory atmosphere where the governor, Bill Janklow of South Dakota, was the governor at the time, and he realized, there are just hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars now of illicit wealth, dirty money, looking to be hidden, looking to become anonymous and stripped from any linkage to the kleptocrats or oligarchs or cartel heads or human traffickers, whoever it is. And what South Dakota could do is they could take their trust industry, make it kind of this really perfect black box. You can put all your money in, nobody can track it, nobody can trace it, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And what South Dakota has really perfected, and we're talking about trusts here, not shell companies, we're talking about trusts are things that, usually have grandparents put money in trusts and they give it for the grandkids, and, they usually expire after a century, and they've been used like that for years and years and years, until South Dakota came along and said, you know what? We don't have to get rid of these trusts after a century. We can keep them forever. You can keep them forever. You can keep them as long as you want. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to have these assets going to somebody else. You can be in perpetual control of all of these assets without anybody knowing anything about it. And the beauty of this, I know, Joe, you mentioned at the top of this conversation, these aren't South Dakotans that are taking advantage of it, right? These are people that don't even need to go to South Dakota. These are people, in some cases, who've never been to South Dakota, that are still plowing all of their money in, using the local, again, trust industry. So these are South Dakota legislators, South Dakota trust companies, South Dakota officials that are allowing this to happen, that are inviting this money in and then not telling anybody around the world whether it's the proceeds of, dictatorship, of gun smuggling, of drug running, of maybe it's connected to the Chinese Communist Party, maybe it's connected to the Iranian regime or Russian oligarchs. We have no idea. But this is what's been happening in South Dakota. We just finally got a glimpse of who's been taking advantage of this South Dakota trust industry.
So how did we find out? Two questions. How did we find out, and how does this benefit the state of South Dakota by allowing it?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one here just briefly, because I do think this highlights of why we have seen this development in South Dakota, but also, as I mentioned, in other smaller states and other states that don't really have that kind of natural resource base, that North Dakota's been blessed with. It doesn't have a lot of other economic underpinnings. What these states realized is that they could create these kind of industries in these states, Delaware, obviously now in South Dakota, that service all of this illicit or ill-gotten or dirty money from abroad that, again, is looking to be made anonymous, but that still allows these kleptocratic figures, these oligarchs, these dictators to still control the money. So what we saw from the state of South Dakota, just like we've seen elsewhere, there are fees that come with registering these trusts or these shell companies, so the state gets a small slice of it. But there are also jobs that are created for it. So in South Dakota, we see accountants, we see lawyers, we see trust companies themselves blossoming and blooming in places like Pierre or places like Sioux Falls to service all of these, again, I keep saying it, oligarchs, kleptocrats, the worst actors, the worst figures in the world that come to South Dakota. So there is some job creation, and the state does take a slice of it. To answer your first question, how do we find out? That's the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question. I don't know. But somebody, somewhere, leaked millions of documents to investigative journalists around the world that showed just what was happening in South Dakota, that showed just what was happening in other places around the world. The listeners may remember the Panama Papers from a few years ago. It's the same dynamic. You have these companies in places like the U.S. or in places like the United Kingdom that are, again, servicing all of this wealth, transforming it into anonymous money, and then moving it elsewhere so nobody can track it, nobody can trace it. Somebody at one of these companies apparently, felt their conscience twinge, or I don't know what happened, but they realized, exactly what was happening, and they thought this needs to see the light of day so legislators and journalists and commentators like ourselves can finally begin ringing the alarm bells about what's been happening.
I don't know too many people that like the word regulation. But the fact of the matter is this smells of the need for regulation. I'd like your opinion on this. Yeah, you understand what's going on better than anybody I've heard explain it so far. And so is there any method to regulate this so that the light of day is shined on it?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is, at the end of the day, what we're going to need more of, more regulation and more transparency, especially. We're talking about now trillions of dollars in unchecked illicit flows that upends everything from national security to the local economies to our politics here in the U.S. We need transparency. And again, we're not talking about the small mom and pop companies that are just trying to make business. We're talking specifically about those companies, those South Dakotans that are taking this money and doing exactly what those oligarchs and what those dictators want them to do with it. That's where the regulation has to come.
Because,
I hope so.
because in this current environment that we have, you mentioned the potential individuals that could be doing this.
Yes.
And so if it goes that far, is this something that the FBI could be looking at? Is this
Absolutely. I have no doubt that the FBI is already making phone calls in South Dakota. I have no doubt that they are already tracking and tracing some of the case studies and some of the details we saw come out just this week. Joel, we're talking about this huge issue, obviously an international issue that South Dakota plays a very large role in, but there is momentum. We do feel things changing in Washington, maybe not in Pierre, but certainly in D.C. There are discussions about what it's going to take, because at the end of the day, the state government down in South Dakota just cannot be trusted to clean up this mess that they have created. It's going to have to be from the federal government itself. We've seen that before, again, with things like shell companies. That's what's going to have to be, because, unfortunately, South Dakota is not going to clean up this mess on its own.
Well, you have to want to. Nothing's going to get done unless you want to. Tell people where they can find your book. Tell people how to get in touch through you or to you through reading.
Absolutely. So the book is called American Kleptocracy, How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History, and it does go into all the details of South Dakota. It's going to be available November 23rd here in the U.S. Check your local bookseller. Anybody and everybody's going to have it if they sell books. As for me, CaseyMichel.com. It's got all my contact info there. And feel free to drop me a line anytime, especially if you've got some details on anything that's happening in South Dakota.
Yeah. Well, something tells me you're going to be getting some calls with people with badges in their hands pretty soon. So
I hope so.
thank you, Casey. Appreciate you coming on.